In 1453, a Venetian merchant recorded something that haunted him for life. He witnessed young boys being systematically mutilated in the Ottoman palace, not as punishment, but as preparation for a life of unimaginable suffering. These were not criminals or slaves. They were children stolen from their families and transformed into something the Ottomans called perfect servants. What happened to these boys reveals one of history's most disturbing systems of abuse. The Venetian merchant's name was Giacomo Bedolla, and his diary entries from 1453 provide some of the most detailed Western accounts of what really happened inside Ottoman palaces. But Bedolla was not the only witness. Diplomatic records, medical texts, and survivor testimonies paint a picture of systematic abuse that lasted for centuries. The boys were not chosen randomly. Ottoman officials specifically targeted children between ages 8 and 12 from Christian families across the empire. They looked for specific traits, intelligence, physical beauty, and most importantly, no family connections powerful enough to seek revenge. Once selected, these children were taken to specialized facilities called preparation houses where the real horror began. The castration itself was just the first step in a process designed to create what the Ottomans called perfect obedience. The Devshirme system was the Ottoman Empire's method of harvesting children. Every few years, officials would sweep through Christian villages in the Balkans, Anatolia, and other conquered territories. They were not looking for volunteers. This was legalized kidnapping on a massive scale. Parents who tried to hide their sons faced execution. Some families mutilated their own children, cutting off fingers or scarring their faces, hoping to make them undesirable for selection. It rarely worked. The chosen boys were chained together and marched to Constantinople in groups of 100 or more. Many died during these forced marches from exhaustion, disease, or suicide attempts. Ottoman records show that officials expected to lose 20 to 30% of the children before they even reached the capital. But for those who survived the journey, the real nightmare was just beginning. The preparation houses were not schools or training facilities. They were factories for creating broken human beings. The castration procedure took place in what Ottoman documents called purification chambers. These were not medical facilities. They were torture rooms disguised as surgery, located in the basement levels of preparation houses across the empire. The timing was calculated for maximum psychological impact. Boys were kept in isolation for days beforehand, listening to the screams of others undergoing the procedure. Ottoman training manuals reveal this was intentional. The anticipation and terror were considered essential parts of breaking their will. When their turn came, the boys were dragged into chambers that reeked of blood and infection. They were held down by multiple adults while a barber surgeon performed the operation using a razor or sharp knife heated in flames. No anesthesia existed, so children were given leather straps to bite down on to prevent them from biting off their own tongues from the pain. But here is what makes this even more horrific. The Ottomans did not just remove the testicles. In many cases, they performed complete emasculation, removing all external male organs. The choice between partial and complete castration depended on the boy's intended role. Those destined for the highest palace positions underwent total emasculation to ensure they could never pose any sexual threat to the Sultan's women. The surgical technique was deliberately crude. Ottoman medical texts describe using red-hot irons to cauterize wounds, a process that caused additional agony but was necessary to prevent immediate death from blood loss. The smell of burning flesh filled these chambers constantly. Medical records from the period describe the immediate aftermath in horrifying detail. Boys were buried up to their waists in hot sand or salt to stop the bleeding and absorb bodily fluids. They were given no water for 3 days, which often led to kidney failure and death. This was not medical ignorance. Ottoman physicians knew that dehydration increased the mortality rate, but they believed survivors of this ordeal would be more psychologically broken. During these 3 days, the boys lay in their own waste, unable to move, often delirious from pain and fever. Many begged to die. Ottoman guards were specifically instructed to ignore these pleas to prevent any attempts at suicide. Those who survived this period faced weeks of agony as their wounds either healed or became fatally infected. The infection rate was deliberately kept high through poor sanitation. Ottoman records show they believed that boys who survived infected wounds were chosen by Allah and would make superior servants. Ottoman physicians documented that roughly 9 out of every 10 boys died within the first month after the procedure. Some died from blood loss, others from infection, kidney failure, or shock. The bodies were disposed of in mass graves outside the city walls. The survivors were not the lucky ones. They were the beginning of an even darker story. The psychological trauma was intentional. Ottoman training manuals specifically state that the extreme pain and helplessness of the castration process was designed to break the spirit completely and create absolute submission to authority. But the physical mutilation was only the beginning. As their bodies healed, these children discovered that their voices would never deepen, their bodies would never develop masculine characteristics, and they would live forever in a liminal state between male and female, exactly as the Ottomans intended. The boys who survived castration entered what the Ottomans called reshaping, a systematic program of psychological destruction that made their physical mutilation seem merciful by comparison. This was not education. It was a carefully designed process to erase their previous identities completely and rebuild them as perfect instruments of servitude. The process began immediately after their wounds healed. They were given new names, always Turkish or Arabic names that had no connection to their Christian origins. These were not just new identities. They were psychological weapons. Boys who forgot their new names or accidentally used their birth names faced severe punishment. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages under penalty of starvation. Ottoman records show that guards would hide among the boys listening for any whispered words in Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, or other native tongues. A single overheard word in their mother language could result in days without food. But the most psychologically devastating tactic was the deliberate lies about their families. The boys were told their parents had sold them willingly, that their families were dead, or that their villages had been destroyed. Even when this was not true, the isolation made it impossible for them to verify these claims. This created a profound sense of abandonment that the Ottomans then exploited. The physical conditioning was equally brutal and methodical. These children were forced to stand motionless for hours, sometimes entire days, until they collapsed from exhaustion. The purpose was not physical fitness. It was teaching absolute stillness and the ability to become invisible when required. They were trained to anticipate their master's needs without being asked. This involved learning to read micro-expressions, body language, and even breathing patterns. Failure to anticipate correctly resulted in severe beatings or being locked in underground cells for days without light. Any sign of independent thought was crushed immediately. Boys who asked questions, showed curiosity, or demonstrated problem-solving skills were subjected to what Ottoman documents call correction procedures, systematic humiliation designed to eliminate intellectual initiative. The daily routine was designed to create learned helplessness. They woke before dawn, spent hours in painful physical positions, received minimal food, and were constantly reminded of their powerlessness. The aspect of their existence was controlled by others. But the most disturbing aspect was the deliberate creation of psychological dependency. The boys were given just enough food to survive, creating constant hunger that made them pathetically grateful for any small kindness from their captives. They were occasionally shown brief moments of gentleness or given tiny privileges, which created powerful trauma bonds with their abusers. This psychological manipulation was so effective that many of these children began to defend the system that had destroyed them. They would report other boys for infractions, compete desperately for their captors' approval, and eventually become willing participants in their own continued abuse. The Ottomans documented this transformation with clinical precision. Training manuals described the exact timeline. Most boys stopped crying after 6 months, stopped asking about their families after 1 year, and began actively seeking approval from their captors after 18 months. By the end of their training period, these children had been transformed into something that was neither fully human nor completely broken. They were living tools programmed to serve without question, incapable of independent survival, and psychologically dependent on the very system that had mutilated and enslaved them. The surviving boys were divided into different categories based on their appearance, intelligence, and how well they had been broken during training. Each category faced its own unique horrors. The most physically attractive became personal attendants to high-ranking officials or members of the royal family. These boys lived in constant fear because their beauty made them targets for sexual abuse from their masters. Ottoman court records document numerous cases of these children being passed between officials like property. Those deemed highly intelligent were trained as administrators and record keepers. They spent their days in windowless rooms, copying documents and managing correspondence. The irony was cruel. Their intelligence, which might have led to great achievements in their original lives, was now used only to serve their captives more efficiently. The strongest survivors became guards within the palace complex. They were given weapons and authority over other servants. But this power came with a terrible price. They were required to enforce the same brutal system that had destroyed them, often punishing other castrated boys who reminded them of their own lost childhood. But regardless of their role, all of these men lived under constant surveillance. Ottoman palace rules required them to sleep in dormitories where they could be watched at all times. Privacy was considered dangerous because it might allow them to remember who they used to be. Their daily routines were designed to prevent any sense of normalcy or human connection. They ate alone, worked in silence, and were forbidden from forming friendships with other servants. Any sign of emotional attachment to another person was seen as a threat to their absolute loyalty to the Sultan. The most heartbreaking aspect was how they aged. These men never experienced normal physical development. Their voices remained high. Their bodies stayed small and weak. And they developed health problems that made their lives increasingly miserable as they grew older. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the few written accounts left by these men themselves. In rare moments when they learned to write, some documented their internal experiences. One account discovered in Ottoman archives in 1987 describes the constant nightmares that plagued these men throughout their lives. They dreamed repeatedly of their childhood homes, their parents' faces, and the lives they might have lived. But upon waking, they felt guilty for these dreams because they had been conditioned to see their past as sinful. Many developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe dissociation. They described feeling like they were watching their lives from outside their bodies, unable to connect with their own experiences or emotions. This was not accidental. It was the intended result of their conditioning. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest ongoing punishment. These men were surrounded by people but forbidden from forming meaningful relationships. They lived in a state of permanent loneliness that lasted decades. As they aged, many became obsessed with training new boys who entered the system. But rather than showing compassion, they often became the harshest enforcers of the same brutality they had endured. The cycle of abuse had become so deeply embedded that they could not break free even when they had the power to do so. Medical records show that these men died younger than average, often from stress-related illnesses or suicide. Even those who lived long lives never recovered psychologically from what had been done to them as children. This system of systematic child abuse continued for over 400 years, destroying the lives of an estimated 200,000 boys. The Ottoman Empire finally banned the practice in 1908, but not because they suddenly developed compassion. They stopped because European powers threatened economic sanctions and the empire was already crumbling. The last generation of these castrated men lived well into the 1960s, carrying their trauma in silence until they died. But here is what historians are only now discovering. The Ottoman records we have relied on for centuries may have been deliberately sanitized. Recent archaeological excavations at former palace sites have uncovered evidence that suggests the documented horrors were just the beginning. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar revealed multiple unmarked burial sites near former preparation houses. The skeletal remains show signs of trauma that do not match any recorded procedures. Some bodies show evidence of repeated surgical interventions, suggesting these children were used for medical experimentation. Even more disturbing, chemical analysis of the soil around these graves indicates the presence of substances that were not supposed to exist in the Ottoman Empire. compounds that suggest these boys may have been subjected to early forms of psychological conditioning drugs. Which raises a terrifying thought. If the Ottomans were willing to hide evidence of additional experiments on these children, what other systematic horrors did they cover up? And how many other lost historical practices are still buried beneath the ground, waiting to reveal even darker truths about what humans are capable of doing to children?